Good day. My name is Yu Tao. I'm an associate professor in Chinese studies at the University of Western Australia, and I'm also the publications officer of ASAA, Asian Studies Association of Australia. And it is my great privilege and pleasure to have this oral history conversation with a great colleague, Professor Tim Wright, here. And before we start, I just want to acknowledge that Tim and I today are sitting on the Nuga land, Nuga Puja, and we pay respect to the Whadjuk Noongar people who are the culture and spiritual custodians of this beautiful land, and we pay respect to elders past and present. So Tim has a long and distinguished career in Chinese studies, Asian studies, and has been, studied and worked in different continents. And it's really my great pleasure to have this opportunity to learn, some of your insights accumulate over the decades. Tim, thank you very much, and welcome to our ASA oral history. Can we start by inviting you to tell us a little bit about your origin story in Asian studies, when, where, and how it all began in particular? Was there a particular, book, film, encounter, or event that helped making you eventually become an Asianist? If that's a fair description.
Yeah, sure. Well, yeah, it's a questionable description, which we'll get into. Okay. I suppose I professionally started to be an Asianist right at the beginning of my undergraduate career because I enrolled to study in Chinese studies. And at that time, unlike now, you didn't do Chinese history or Chinese politics. You did Chinese and Chinese and Chinese.
So when was that, if I may?
I started in 1967.
Right.
So a long time ago.
The starting year of the Cultural Revolution.
The second year of the Cultural Revolution in China, yes. So to understand why I made that decision, we'll get on to the other part of the question, which is a specific, it was in fact an encounter that pushed me in this direction. And that was the influence of a teacher I had at school when I was 13 or 14. Now, our form master had, in the year before he taught us, been on a world trip, what we now call a gap year, and had spent a lot of time in East Asia, Hong Kong. You couldn't go into China at that time, but Hong Kong and Japan. Now, he was actually paid to teach us ancient Greek poetry. However, at least in the times he wasn't teaching us ancient Greek poetry, he spoke with great enthusiasm about East Asia, China, Chinese, Japanese, etc. And he was that sort of inspirational figure that had an influence on at least those of his students who were open to that sort of influence. I don't know whether you've seen the film Dead Poets Society, which is actually about a teacher, not at all in Chinese, but he was enthusing his school students about English poetry. But again, it was very much a similar type of person that not all, my friends in education hate Dead Poets Society because they think teaching is about being professional and not about inspiration. And this guy was, I'm not saying he wasn't professional, but he certainly had that inspiring quality. And in fact, there was myself in my year, two people in the year after that, and one person in the year after that, after which I lost contact, who all studied Chinese or Japanese at university because of this guy.
Right.
And this was the mid early to mid 1960s.
Yeah, and
so
that was
it's very different from now. So
and that was in Britain.
that was in Britain, yes.
Right.
I grew up in Yorkshire, and it was a sort of fairly high-profile school in Bradford Grammar School in Yorkshire. So his influence lasted. Well, it's lasted my whole life, I suppose. I mean, he had more influence on me than anybody else apart from my parents, probably. In terms of what I became. So it just shows how, well, to some extent, it's a chance encounter, can turn your life in a particular direction, and that is what propelled me into deciding to do Chinese studies at university, and then, as things worked out reasonably well, continue in Chinese studies throughout my career.
So may I ask you, which year did you go to university, and what did you study as an undergraduate in those years?
Right, I started it was a 4-year degree, and it was 1967 to 1971. All our study was Chinese, so roughly it would have been 50% modern Chinese, 50% Wanyan, the classical Chinese.
So when you say Chinese, that was Chinese language.
We studied both
Right.
the language.
Right.
We, as first-year students, we sat down and translated Mencius. So it was a very intense. I mean, we haven't done it that way in any of the institutions I've taught, and I'm not sure that that's the way to do it. We can talk about that later, but there are lots of competing pressures, demands, and that sort of met one particular demand, which was Chinese language. Of course, it didn't include spoken Chinese. I mean, we did a little bit of spoken Chinese, but I mean, I suppose you can learn to read Chinese in England, but learning to speak it, certainly with any fluency, you really have to go to China. And going to China was not a possibility.
And that was
at
the
stage.
the high days of the Cold War.
It was the high, it was completely impossible unless you had connections with the Chinese Communist Party.
So when did you first go to China? Was that when you do PhD or?
No, it was in fact immediately after my graduation as an undergraduate, but it was only a tour.
Right.
It was a 1-month tour for young people, organised by the Society for Chinese Anglo-Chinese Understanding, and we were taken around. I mean, in fact, there are many places in China which I haven't seen. I mean, Jinggangshan, for example, we went to. So
very revolutionary side.
We'll come on to later that I've studied coal mining, and we actually went to a coal mine, the Pingxiang coal mine.
Right.
However, we weren't sort of interested in the coal mine. We were interested in how Mao Zedong led the miners' movement and how Liu Shaoqi betrayed the miners' movement.
Interesting, because of the time.
Because of the time, yes, exactly.
So which year exactly was that?
This was 1971. It was August 1971. Right. Now, of course, August 1971, an awful lot was happening in China.
Just before the Lin Biao.
Immediately before the Lin Biao. I mean, I think probably the Lin Biao thing happened immediately after we left or something.
Right.
But clearly it was
not because of your.
No, I wouldn't claim that it was because of our vision.
Right. But it was an interesting time.
Oh, it was an interesting time, and certainly one got a very strong feeling of the importance of the PLA, the army, in Chinese society at the time, because most of the places we went to there was the head of the commune or what sitting there, but next to him was the PLA representative, and there was no doubt about who was the more important of those. So we of course didn't see any of that. We were taken around, shown revolutionary history, taken to model places, etc. And as Mao says, one divides into two, so the group divided into those who believed 100% of what they were being told and those who believed 95% of what they were being told, when we should have been believing 5% or less. But still, it gave me a chance to see a China totally unrecognizable to what one would see if one went today. It's a totally different world.
So that's fascinating. So that was the time that you have already spent a few years studying the language.
I'd spent the 4 years studying the language.
So will you be able to communicate with anyone?
Oh yes, I mean, not very well. I mean, but we could certainly get by, and we could certainly read. So that was okay. But none of us, I think, were fluent. So we it was enough for communication.
It's also interesting that even during the middle of the Cold War and some of these tours, of course, they had been carefully designed. But despite that, I think you as someone who studied Chinese language, but first time in China, still gained quite a lot.
Oh yes,
from the tour.
Oh yes,
that's interesting. I think that has quite some implications on today how we think about, for example, sending our students to Asia and to enrich their learning experience.
I mean, certainly nowadays the system where students spend a year or what have you in China is much better than we were able to manage.
So did that tour had an impact on how you later choose your career or research? Or what happened during that period that made you from a undergraduate of Chinese studies eventually choose to have a career in studying China?
I mean, I can't say that the trip itself steered me in a new direction. I mean, I had done reasonably well as a student, and had, from my later undergraduate years, intended to go on to do a PhD. In fact, I spent a year in Hong Kong immediately after 71, 72, studying with a very distinguished economic historian of China. And then I came back, and the head of department, my PhD supervisor, was actually an economic historian of the Tang dynasty. And I had expected to study ancient Chinese history
and that was in Cambridge, right?
This was in Cambridge.
And that was the department in those days still called Oriental Studies?
Oh yes.
And now it's Asian and Middle East.
Probably Middle East, but yes, very definitely Oriental Studies.
But not in the, for example, economic department. It's mainly in the area studies department. Or was that a modern division that nowadays we emphasize?
No, entirely in area studies. However, very much following on with what you've just said, my supervisor said, well, if you're going to study economic history, you need at least some economics. So in fact, in the first year after I got back, 72, 73, I did study economics, not formally, only informally, which maybe I regret slightly, I don't know. But and then at the end of that, I came back to my supervisor and said, well, I've actually become more interested in modern economic development, and I prefer to do something on modern history rather than on
the Tang
Dynasty, rather than the Tang list. And he sort of said, fine, you'd better do coal then.
Well,
that 30-second, less than 30-second exchange determined the rest of my.
But did the supervisor explained later why coal not?
Well, no, he didn't specifically explain, but I think he recognized that as something which was firstly a major industry in China.
Yes.
I mean, certainly it's one of the biggest industries now, and it was one of the biggest industries then, obviously much smaller then than it is now. And he also recognized that there was really no comprehensive study of the industry, certainly not in English.
Yeah.
So it was an area where a keen student perhaps could make a name for himself.
And retrospectively, and probably because of your own contribution as well. And now we think about that, it's such a good choice, isn't it? I mean, because it's an important industry, as you said, but also it's a very good industry to link all these great events in contemporary, modern and contemporary China.
Yeah.
So really, I mean, you can ask all sorts of questions about modern and contemporary China or Asia in that way.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, in fact, I've always sort of seen my work as not really being on coal, but more using coal to explore some of the major issues, events, etc., in Chinese history, so that the PhD thesis, which turned later into my first book, looked, at the impact of imperialism. Well, the two biggest mines in China were owned by the British and the Japanese. It looked at the what was called bureaucratic capitalism, so the role of warlords and the politicians in the industry, which is an issue way beyond just coal. And the third sort of main area was the workers' movement. So I looked at how there were several obviously the most famous strike of all was Hanyuan and Bingxiang coal mines, but Kailuan had a very high profile labour disputes as well. So it did my aim, and I am sure that my supervisor was a very, very, very bright guy, was aware that it would open all these windows for me onto Chinese history.
That's wonderful. So on that note, can I ask you, when you look back so many decades of your career, how do you actually describe yourself and your expertise as an academic?
Right.
Sorry,
no,
controversial.
I mean, it reflects the tensions and contradictions in area studies academics. I mean, on the one hand, my actual career has always been within area studies departments. So after my PhD, I had a couple of years postdoc then, but then I got a research fellowship in what was then called the Department of Far Eastern History at the ANU, and then moved to Murdoch for Chinese Studies. And then after Murdoch, I moved to Sheffield, the School of East Asian Studies. So that's always been my career. And I suppose my core expertise, such as it is in that area of Chinese studies. However, partly the year I did in economics, but partly my own predilections to try to link developments in China and Chinese history with broader theoretical and thematic issues. I've always been had another sort of iron in the fire, which was as an economic historian. Of course, economic historian, you already have another tension between economics and history, and I suppose within that, I've generally been on the history side rather than the economic side. I've never used regression analysis and that sort of thing. Although, some of my colleagues feel that, I did manage some of the economic concepts reasonably well. But so my nature has been pulled in different directions to some extent, and I wonder. I mean, I came close once, well, to getting jobs in economic history departments once I applied and wasn't selected. Once I was asked to apply and didn't apply. So what if I'd been in an economic history department? I imagine that my approach and work and career would have been somewhat different. But that's not to say I regret it. I mean, one has to, you take advantage of the situation you're in, and there's no point in sort of saying the grass is greener on the other side. I mean, it would be different, but
and also this, there could be a temporal dimension there as well, because the tensions there between area and disciplinary studies, but this tension also shaped by the period in which we're talking about and all these dynamics. But can I ask you you already told us your first book, but can you tell us a little bit about, one book, article, or other publication that you think, when you look back for that case, really reflects your work very well? Or it can be a couple if you have, different stages of your career.
I mean, I'll choose my second book, the one on the, well, it was then contemporary, it's now receding into history, the contemporary Chinese coal industry. Again, I choose that because on the one hand, you have this focus on coal, which I've had for not all of my career, but much of my career. But on the other hand, again, it was aimed at analysing some of the key issues in particularly reform period China through the light of that industry. So I looked, for example, at the reform of prices and at the way that the industry was marketized very imperfectly and incompletely, which of course again is an issue way beyond the coal mining industry. The second sort of major focus was on the township and village enterprises, so the small semi-private enterprises emerging in rural China. Again, there were many other industries in which this was the case. I had the small coal miners had a very bad press and sort of routinely denounced. I took a slightly more sympathetic view in that I could see their role in improving the people's lives in their area.
A local perspective.
I mean, that a lot of the bad press came from struggles between the centre and the localities, and struggles between the big state-owned enterprise mines and the private mines. Now, I'm not saying that the criticisms were totally unjustified. What I am saying, I think, is that there was another dimension, another side to it. My material came a lot from the Chinese press, and I cited a story of a particular village where 40% or something of the young men couldn't find wives. They opened a couple of coal mines. The young men got jobs in the coal mines, made a reasonable amount of money, and were able to get married. So yes, of course, there were. I mean, safety was obviously an issue, and some of them would have not survived. But still, it provided, I mean, again, perhaps unlike some of the other township and village enterprises which operated in the suburbs of Shanghai or Zhejiang, where there were probably many other options in remote areas of Shanxi, etc. If there wasn't coal, there wasn't really very much at all. So really, they were dependent on the small mines to bring themselves out of poverty.
Right.
And so I felt that certainly for a period these mines did provide had a very role which was positive as well as negative. I suppose again the third theme, which again has much wider implications, was the fate and role of the workers in the reform period. I looked at what happened to wages, and in general, there's a feeling that one of the losers, or not losers, but certainly the smaller gains from the reforms were with the urban workers, that the urban workers were left behind by small businessmen, etc. And there you can certainly see the coal mining suffered quite badly because of that, because the incompleteness of the reforms meant that they were held coal prices very low. Therefore, coal companies were not profitable. Therefore, it was difficult for them to pay higher wages, and in fact, often it was difficult to pay wages at all. So we see coal miners' wages falling behind not only the general growth of GDP, but even behind manufacturing wages. And then from the mid-2000s, the trend somewhat changed, and the position of coal miners improved very, very substantially. And the final sort of, again, within the area of workers, I looked at the issue of safety and analysed both the reasons why China was finding it difficult to improve safety. Partly the economic pressures with low prices, partly the struggle between the safety officials who looked up to the Ministry of Coal, or I should say work safety in Beijing, as against the local government, which was more interested in making sure that GDP increased, both to give the officials good tick in their career box, but also to, as I said, those mines did contribute to local welfare. Yes. So, it's not, I don't think it should be, I mean, there was plenty of corruption involved, but I don't think that one should just say, well, that's all there is to say about it. So I looked at that, and then in the last 5 years before I published the book, there began what was a spectacular improvement. In fact, I published an article on safety in China Quarterly in 2004, and I said I thought it would be very difficult for China to move quickly, and I was completely wrong.
Right.
That over the next 20 years, between the early 2000s and the early 2020s, the improvement was spectacular. No other word for it. Yes, I use the official figures, and yes, we're sceptical about the official figures. And yes, the official figures don't include all combined accidents or fatalities. I mean, that's taken for granted. However, to say that there was anything else but a dramatic improvement, it's almost impossible to reconcile the figures with anything else but a spectacular improvement.
So are you still tracing that trend contemporarily, or
I have sort of. I mean, I did publish an article in 2022 again, more or less sort of the son of the earlier article type of thing. So I traced it reasonably carefully up to then, and since then I've sort of kept a little bit looking at the figures, but and there was, I mean, one of the things that made people suspicious was that from 2004, I think, to about 2023 or 2022, I'm not sure, that every year the situation improved. Now, if you look at other coal industries, even when the situation improving over time, it goes up and down, right, where it didn't in China. I would explain that partly by the fact that China is just so big that there's an averaging effect, that some provinces went up, others went down. But people did say, well, that shows the figures are shonky. Then in 2023, or I can't remember exactly which, the figures went up a little bit. Right. I mean, nothing, 6,000 were dying in 2000, and it's down to 200 or something. Right. So,
but it's a small variation.
It's a small variation, but at least enough to show that maybe the figures, are at least within their limitations meaningful.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And so based on that, I mean, now I think we know quite a lot about your research and the coal economy in China and the important questions surrounding that. So if we go back to our discipline, like Asian studies, and you did earlier mention that all your career, like all your appointments, were actually in Asian studies or area studies departments or centers. So, and you also mentioned that you came to Australia, I presume, with the appointment in ANU.
Yes, right? Correct.
Was that the main reason you came to Australia?
It's the only reason I came. I mean,
or job.
I came for a job. I mean,
Okay. And which year was that?
That was 1978.
1978.
Yeah.
And from there and all the way, when did you go to Sheffield?
Sheffield 2000.
2000. So that's a good 20 odd years.
20 odd years, yeah.
Yeah. So in those years, and also I'm presumably that when you go to when you went to Sheffield, you still had some links with the Australians, Asian studies. So we're talking about several decades of the changes of the discipline. Do you mind if I invite you to basically introduce a little bit about, not necessarily like a structural analysis of the changes, but just your feeling over the years? Maybe we start from a very direct question, like what was your involvement, if any, with the Asian Studies Association of Australia?
I was always a regular attendee at the ASAA conferences.
Yeah. So what was the scale, for example, of those conferences in the late 20th century? Much smaller, I think, than nowadays.
Well, I don't know what it is nowadays. Well,
nowadays it's a few hundred papers.
Yeah, it would be smaller than that, I think.
Yeah, 3-4 days, and many.
It would be 3-4 days. I mean, and I mean they weren't tiny by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, at one ASA meeting, they discussed the setting up of a Chinese Studies Association in Australia.
Oh, okay.
And actually, I was against that, despite the fact I went on to become president of Chinese Studies. Basically, because I felt it would detract from, for example, the ASA conferences. I mean, because I wasn't sure that busy people would necessarily be able to get produce enough to present one paper at the ASAA, another paper the CSAA, etc. So I sort of thought, well, I'm not sure we shouldn't be protecting. Anyway, I lost, but and then we set up and we survived. I would have, how many? I mean, my guess would have been 100 to 200 in those times.
So since you mentioned the CSA as well, so in those years, what was the relationship between, for example, the air studies, Asian studies, and then there's specific country-specific studies like Chinese studies, Japanese studies, and later Korean and maybe Indonesian studies always there. Like, what was the, I mean, from an academic disciplines perspective, are experts in these country-specific areas always work together, or like more like today, they not always had a chance to collaborate? Or is it that's a long-term structural issue there, I suppose?
I think it's a long-term structural issue. I think in some respects the issue is most intractable for Chinese. Now, I don't quite know why that is. I mean, I'll give you an example that when I was in England, I went to, actually it was only the first day, but they held a workshop at the British Academy, basically comparing China and India. So, there'd be each session had a China speaker and an Indian speaker.
Right.
India, not necessarily Indian speaker. And say on the economy or on demography, what have you. And certainly that first day that I attended, it was very, very noticeable that all speakers on India attempted specifically to make comparisons with China or to bring in other areas as a broader perspective. All the China speakers focused on China, 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 and China.
Right.
And
so not much comparison at all. Or
very little.
Yeah.
Very little. And I think, I mean, in fact, I was the evening or the next morning, I had to go off to Taiwan. But I was talking to one of the organisers who actually had been married to a China person, Gordon White. And she said, well, that's always what Gordon said, that China people were very much inward looking, if you want. Now, I mean, to some extent, you can defend that not so much against India, but in most other places, that China is so vast and varied that there is enough of importance, enough of interest, enough of variation within the field of China that you don't so much that you don't need to go outside, but that it's you could find enough without going outside. But I don't I don't think that any of the they weren't really they were separate country groups. They would see themselves, I think, as somewhat linked to the ASAA, but not so much horizontally, so that I think there would be very little contact or collaboration between Chinese studies and Japanese studies. A little bit more when I went to the UK, where again I was involved in well, there was not an Asian studies one at all. So, but because Sheffield did Chinese studies, Japanese studies, and Korean studies, we did have some collaboration and some comparison there. but still it was fairly separate.
Right. So I suppose one of the challenges that emerge in your talk is kind of sometimes if the, let's say, Chinese studies, they do have a critical mass, that will be maybe a blessing, but also a curse for broader collaboration with other subjects. And I know that in the Europe, for example, the Chinese studies, one of those Asian studies subjects that likely to have a critical mass in comparison, for example, Korean studies, which is quite a latecomer. But I wonder though, in your early years in Western Australia, I mean, one thing that we definitely feel now as Asian specialists in Western Australia, regardless which country group, right, is the lack of critical mass in any of our WA universities. But in your days, like, how was the landscape? I didn't know that Murdoch had a very big Asian research center, but in those days, do you already have a critical mass, or you feel you had a critical mass that to sustain Asian studies in the West in WA itself, or you also face some of the maybe psychological stress we have nowadays being Asian specialists in Western Australia?
I think these issues have always been there, to be honest.
That made me feel slightly better.
Yeah, I mean, certainly Chinese, I mean, at the maximum, there were 4 people in Chinese studies at Murdoch. Later, of course, UWA set up and Keating moved a bit in, etc. But there was never, I mean, I always looked outside the department for academic ideas and links, etc. I mean, inevitably, that's not a criticism of but you didn't have a critical mass in terms of people working on at all cognate areas. Now, for example, I mean, you mentioned the Asia Research Centre. That would be less true for say Indonesia, where I think there was more of a critical mass, and there were quite a number of people working. I mean, often Dick Robison's PhD students, but working on sort of similar issues and similar topics with similar approach. Japanese. I mean, Indonesian, of course, if we grumble about China, I mean, Indonesian moved from being really quite strong in the 1990s to being more or less in crisis nowadays, whereas Chinese has always sort of got on, never as strong as Japanese. Of course, there was the boom of student interest in Japan, which created critical mass among the students, at least, less so, I suspect, among the teachers, because a lot of it was language teaching. I mean, I remember at one of the ASAA conferences talking to a Japanese lady who taught Japanese and bemoaning the fact that we had hardly any students in Chinese studies and they had lots of students in Japanese studies. She said, "You're quite wrong, because your students are interested in China. My students are only interested in money."
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's my experience in the UK is exactly the same. That very difficult to build up critical mass. It's whether you're in an area studies department, which tends to be vulnerable as a department. I mean, the department that I left has, I mean, I don't quite know what the exact outcome is, but they were threatened with being the teachers, reduced redundancies of teachers, etc. So, if you're a department, you're threatened on that level. If you're in disciplinary department, China historians, etc. Again, that position is always under threat. If you leave, then there are plenty of other sort of piranhas moving in and wanting to eat that position.
Yeah. But sometimes it's worse than that. The position, because it's in humanities, might not get filled.
Of course.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, when I mean, to some extent, the Asian studies an inverted U sort of thing, that it in the Hawke Keating era, it did increase. But even before that, I mean, when I first arrived in Australia, just about every history department in every university in Australia had at least one, and often two, proper China historians. Now, by proper China historians, I mean people able to use Chinese sources and studying China for its own sake, rather than as an example of the expansion of Britain. So, I mean, here, UWA had Les Marchand and Liu Yapwing. Adelaide certainly had two. And, now they're those either because, as you say, with Adelaide, for example, I mean, there were two China people in a department of 30 or something like that. And eventually the numbers of the department were chopped away. And now I don't know what number they are, but sort of probably in single figures and without a China historian, as far as I know.
What do you think are the reasons for these trends or the decline, really? Because in a way, economically, Australian is closer, I think, to Asia or to China. China is now by far the largest trading partner. But you're right. I mean, if we look at academically, I think in the late 20th century, all the way to the early 21st century, if we're talking about China studies or Chinese history in that particular sense, that we do have Australian scholars winning Leveson Prize, which is the most prestigious prize in China studies. Nowadays, of course, we are yet to find the next Australian winners. So, what made that contrast? Like economically closer, but in terms of the actual Asian capability in the academic field, it seems like it's get marginalized quite a lot.
Yeah, I mean, clearly the role of the government is important in this.
Right.
Now, the Keating government very explicitly attempted to build up Asian literacy and Asian studies capacity, and put money into it.
So in those years in the university, you did feel that.
Oh, there was no doubt about that. Yes.
So in which mechanisms, if I may ask, were that the center of excellence in Asian studies, or is it more like the secondary schools getting more students study language and then sent to university, or anything that we actually don't know nowadays?
I mean, I think all of the above, really.
Right.
There were a number of specific initiatives of the particularly Keating, but Hawke Keating governments to fund students to go, including PhD students, and they did some funds, I think, some positions. I can't remember the complete details of that. On the other hand, they did put efforts into building Chinese, Japanese, etc., in schools, and the flow through of people from schools, provides the students, which keeps the department alive. But I mean, clearly the Howard government was basically not interested in, I mean, not, but basically. And at the same time, you move to this neoliberal approach, which said the government isn't going to pick winners. We're just going to let the market follow market forces. And there, if we're not getting the students through. Now, of course, 1989 was a very bad thing for students, in terms of students. On the other hand, the Japanese boom ended as the Japanese economic boom tailed off, so that the number of students coming through was declining, and that made the departments weaker.
So can I ask you, Tim, a very probably controversial question, but I really want to know it. Like in your days, in Western Australia, when you were, doing managerial positions in area studies, were you sometimes under the pressure to demonstrate to either, let's say, your managers or the stakeholders of the university, by which government is an important one, or the community, that there is a need for area studies? Do you need to justify that in those days?
Oh yes,
You still need it justify.
Oh yes, absolutely, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, without any question.
And justify in front of what disciplinary colleagues, or in terms of let's say the students or the government funders.
I mean, ASAA, of course, played a major role in attempting to demonstrate it to the government. I mean, as individual academics, unless we had a major role in ASAA, not so much. I mean, going to the government, but to within the university, yes, all the time, and to students, and, attempting to explain and encourage students to come and embark on area studies was a continuous struggle.
Right, right. In that regard, I feel, yeah. I mean, even though it wasn't the old kind of positive memory of the history, but ironically, I think it's very good to hear that for me, because really, I mean, there's no new things under the sun, I suppose. Lots of challenges which now we feel very urgently. And in the half century of ASA's history, that those things happened before. Some of those things are constant struggles, and people do go through the struggles, and we are still doing well in some extent, to some extent. So on that note, Tim, as we're finishing this, if I might invite you to advise us on a few things, or one things that you think we as professionals in this department, in the discipline, as Asianists, either like collectively, as group or individually, what can we do better to prepare ourselves for the future?
I don't think there are any easy answers there. I mean, I think within universities, we have to work hard to establish and nurture link to disciplinary departments. I think, I mean, to some extent, it's better than it was. I mean, I think nowadays, in a lot of areas, by no means all, it would be accepted that any serious study of history, economics, etc., has to take account of China. That probably wasn't true 30 or 40 years ago. But equally, we have to recognize that the investment for an individual in tooling up, learning Chinese language is a very, very substantial investment, and that it's probably never going to be the case that very large numbers are able or willing to make that investment. However, we can't leave things at that. We want to make sure that historians, that economists, that business people do take account of the Chinese experience. Now, there's no easy answers there because they're looking at China without knowing the language. And what I mean, well, I was asked at one of the reviews justifying, of our department in Sheffield, the professor of politics said, well, do you think it's possible for an academic who doesn't know, he was actually Japanese, but doesn't know Japanese, to do useful work on Japan? And I said, well, yes, but suppose you go to Japan and you meet a professor of English politics in Japan who doesn't speak any English. What are you going to think about that? And so, I mean, obviously, in practical terms, vastly more numbers of academics or other people are able to acquire English, and the investment in acquiring English is much less than the investment in acquiring Chinese or Japanese. But still, I mean, again, at the British Academy, we discussed this once or twice, that, how far do we want to encourage people who don't know Chinese or have any real China expertise, to how far are we going to fund them to study China? Now, I was a bit of a skeptic in that, but I wouldn't want to push that too far either, because I think that we do have to encourage a broader involvement with understanding of Asia, which cannot just be limited to people who have put in the investment to learn the language. But on the other hand, of course, we need the people who are willing to put in the investment. So, we have to have our cake and eat it, I'm afraid. I think there is no resolution of that.
Right.
It's a matter which we, or you now, will have to continue to work through, and where, with a changing situation, there'll be different constraints and opportunities. So I think it's very difficult to sort of give specific advice, because it's it'll depend so much on what actually the economic, political, etc. situation allows or encourages or constrains.
But thank you very much, Tim. And I think to a large extent, and knowing lots of these challenges that our discipline is facing at the moment is not entirely new. It has been there for quite some time, and in the foreseeable future, it will probably still be there. It's also liberating in a way, because people will know. I mean, lots of myths of these things are unprecedented, and it's kind of very challenging now is it's not true, right? Knowing that something has happened and people has made efforts, in itself is encouraging and empowering, because it means that there are things could be done, and some of the if we do take the Buddhist kind of idea, I mean, some of the struggles, they are just continuing. The struggle itself is the process, and probably the goal is not to imagine, how to really get rid of all these constraints, but how to make the most within these constraints. So on that note, thank you so much, Tim, for sharing your insights and experience, and thank you so much.
Thank you.